Welcome back again to another episode of Managing Your Mental Health in COVID-19. And I'm really thrilled today to be able to talk about stress with my very special guest, Dr. Anna-Marie Wysynski. And Dr. Wysynski is actually an emergency room physician, but also practices family medicine. She has a bespoke functional medicine clinic just outside of Toronto in the GTA, and is currently adapting to the times by seeing patients both virtually and through telemedicine. And she's a hormone specialist. And I've been talking to her for many years now about hormones and managing hormones. So I thought, who better to get on the show than someone who is an expert in hormones and can actually explain stress to us and the stress chemicals and the damage that they do. Because I've been saying all along, that I know for myself, if I don't manage my mental health, that it has a profound effect on my physical health and then on my financial health, on the health of my relationships and my family. Mm-hmm. So in my life, this has always been top of mind. And I think, and we were talking just before the show, we were talking about the fact that these are really unique circumstances in that, we have our regular stress, but now for a lot of us, we're at home, working from home. We've got kids at home, a lot of people, that they're having to worry about the homeschooling and making sure they're on the computer and they're doing their work. And we've probably got a partner or a significant other who's working from home as well. So we're spending 24 hours a day locked in our homes pretty much with people whom we love and are really close to us. But let's face it, we don't generally spend 24 hours a day. And here in Toronto, this is, I think, week 5 of the social isolation. So this has been going on for over a month. And I'm betting, as you know, I'm no stranger to stress myself. I have an enormous amount of stress that comes from the travel and the work that I do that I kind of like. I mean, it's what keeps me going. But I feel right now that even while there's a giant pause button been pushed, I'm feeling stressed. But it feels like it's a completely different kind of stress than the stress that I normally feel when I'm out working. So does that even make any sense? Is this possible that we can be feeling a different stress than the normal kind of stress that we feel in our lives? Is that real?
Absolutely, Sue. Thanks for having me here to discuss stress. And in fact, stress is one of those things that when people hear we have so much of it that we almost want to tune it out and go, don't want to hear it because we know that we need to do something about it. And we always feel we don't have the time. So thanks for having us take some time to talk about this. You're right. This kind of stress is different. If I can make the analogy, as children, many of us remember going to the Midway or the circus that came to town, the traveling circus, and there was that ride where you would stand against the wall of a round tube that would be spun around, and eventually, without knowing, the floor would fall out. And I think that's what's happening right now. This is not just your usual roller coaster ride where when you go up and down the hills that your stomach's going to flip and your heart's going to beat really fast. Right now, everybody's sort of grabbing the wall going, holy shit. I'm sorry, holy crap, is the floor going to fall out? Is the bottom going to fall out? So yes, seems like a different stress, but that's the whole point of stress. Stress is really our response to a situation. It's physiological, it's psychological, and it's environmental. So there's so many things that influence our stress that yes, we can be perceiving this as different.
Okay, so and I think we've all heard this, but I think this needs to be really brought home right now. So it's not actually what's happening out there, but it's how we're responding to it.
Right.
And the greatest of our fears is the fear of the unknown. And so, like you said, it feels like there's no bottom and we're kind of free falling with the unknown. Right. So what happens in our body then? Why is it stress has such an effect on our physical health?
So let me clarify one thing. So yes, this situation is externally imposed. So this is like an environmental stress or a situational stress. So even though the stressor is there, our response to it is really quite important in how it manifests in terms of, is it suffering or sorrow, or is it manageable? And I think that's the difference that people feel. So in our bodies, when we perceive stress, there are different types of stress. So there is something called eustress, which means that we have a stressor and it really doesn't cause a negative outcome. It's sort of pleasant, acceptable, or actually even happy. So there could be great stress. If you win a lottery, that's a stress, but it's a good stress. However, this stress, because of the uncertainty, and as you say, fear. So in the circles of talking about stress or personal development, we talk about fear as an acronym of false evidence appearing real. Because oftentimes it's how we interpret the stress. What does it mean? What does it mean that we have to suspend our mortgage right now if you're in that situation? Or what does it mean that your business is not having clients, or your revenue has decreased, or your children are at home and homeschooling? So the meaning that we ascribe to it, or the stories we tell ourselves around the situation, is very important. And when that happens, a cascade of hormonal responses are set off in the body that can cause things like the physiological response of stress, the sweating, the nausea, the stomach grinding, the heart palpitations, the headache, or the psychological stress, the ruminating. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen? How are we going to get through this? On and on. And we all have those kind of responses. And I want to underscore that this is natural. This is actually a survival mechanism that is hardwired into us as far as we can record.
Interesting. So, so I like what you said, and it's something I know to be true. It's actually not necessarily what's happening to us. It's the story that we tell ourselves about what's happening.
Right.
And this is the trap that I notice I'm having to be very careful of, because if I watch too much news or I listen to too much news, then you hear those headlines, that this could go on for 18 months to 2 years. Mm-hmm. And then I start, my imagination goes, and I start imagining 18 months down the road, a year down the road, social isolation. And I can actually talk myself into a panic if I allow myself to go down that road.
Absolutely. And I don't think you're unique in that. I myself have had a huge stress response to this as well. As a frontline healthcare worker right now, understanding that the mortality rate in places like Italy and China were so high, I was sort of paralyzed for days about, wow, I'm going to have to go back into this on my next shift. And what does that mean? What about my family? What about my partner? What about my house? What about my patients? Could I be carrying it? Even in the grocery store, having those stress responses. And so even for myself, knowing what I know about stress, I was also concerned about so many things and finding myself caught in the stress response. And it took some digging deep. It was also sort of a metamorphosis, if you might, sort of coming full circle about going through the stress and going through the despair, and even contemplating things like my mortality and what was going to happen if I got sick. Would I die? Would my family be okay? Is the insurance paid? Like all these thoughts, and then coming back to, okay, get your doctor's stethoscope on and your white coat, and let's get back into the field and do what we're trained to do. Many people can't go through that circle. Many people get stuck at different spots of the circle, depending on our psychological resilience, our physiological resilience, our past traumas. In fact, there is something called legacy trauma, where from generations ago, we could be carrying that trauma in our DNA, so to speak. And what happened to our forefathers may be actually playing out. Or when we watched our parents as children or young adults, if they had a financial crisis, the furnace needed replacing suddenly, or the car died unexpectedly, or there was a major expense, or a layoff, or an illness, how our parents and our family coped through that, role models that for us, and psychologically and unconsciously that gets imprinted. So we can also fall back into these old patterns, even though many of us are like, when I grow up, I'm not going to be like my parents. We still have that propensity through genes, through role modeling, through psychological behaviors of falling back into those familial patterns, even though we're trying to swim against the current sometimes and breaking those patterns.
Oh, okay. So that makes sense. Absolutely. So it's normal. So this is good. So we're not alone. It's
exactly
normal. We're all feeling this. But why is it so important? Because there's been a lot of talk about stress management for years and years and years. But what does negative stress do to the body?
Great question. So your body has no idea, my body, our bodies have no idea whatsoever whether we have good stress or bad stress. The interpretation comes in our psychology and our understanding of stress, that story that we tell ourselves. So stress in general doesn't matter if you win the lottery or the bottom falls out. The body still responds, and it will gear up the hormone reactions that I talked about. It can actually disturb our sleep. It can change our appetite. It could change the way we digest and absorb nutrients from our gut. It will actually cause psychological distress, physiological distress, such as rapid heart rate, heart attacks, bone loss. So the body acidifies under stress. And when we actually have this acidic pH in our body, it pulls the calcium out of our bones. So it accelerates bone loss. It accelerates damage in our arteries. So for example, as our blood pressure rises under the influence of stress hormones, we get these little damaged areas to our arteries. And the cure for that, the Band-Aid for that, is cholesterol. So we start creating little nicks in the arteries. We don't consciously do this. The body has this happen. And the cholesterol is actually the physiological Band-Aid. It can cause us to age, so wrinkling, hair loss. It can cause our thyroid to malfunction. So again, appetite, metabolism, bone mass, and muscle loss can be happening, or breakdown of bone and muscle. The hair loss is a huge one. Sleep disturbances, and then that sets off a whole other cascade of things, and including the stress response itself of worry, the distress. There's really not any process in our body that is not affected. Many people will get irritable bowel syndrome, so running to the bathroom too frequently or not being able to move their bowels, which also causes other physiological problems as well. So the physical rashes is another one, hives, chronic hives. So really from inside out, from top to bottom, there's really not an area of our body that is not affected by some form of stress response.
Wow. Okay. So this is why I asked you to come on the show, actually, because so there's significant damage that we could be doing to ourselves through feeling this stress, so our own physical health.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now I have 3 questions. So
Sure.
is this the reason where, and I'm not a medical doctor, I don't know any of this is true. I just know, what I've read repeatedly
Sure.
or what I've experienced myself. Is this why they say that stress actually causes people to gain weight around the middle? Is that what's going on? It's the stomach response or the chemical response, and why we gain weight around our middle?
Absolutely. So this is what we commonly call muffin topping in our generation, right? So even if you go, when you go out in public and you see young people, 20s, late teens, 30s with muffin topping, this is all hormone related. And what happens under the influence of stress is that the enzymes that catalyze reactions in our body that change one form of hormone to another accelerate. And what that means is that then we start getting belly fat, and belly fat in the muffin topping is a clear sign of chronic stress. It could be from medications, it could be from just psychological stress, and also other behaviors that go associated along with stress, such as alcohol consumption. Alcohol increases an enzyme that is responsible for converting certain hormones to other hormones, accelerating the accumulation of belly fat.
Wow.
It also is an indicator of inflammation. So the inflammatory cascade is wide open under stress. And that also encourages the tearing down of healthy tissues like bone and muscle and the accumulation of fat. So the other issue when we get belly fat or muffin topping is not just that we have this fat under our skin. That develops after we accumulate fat around and in our muscles, in our organs. So for example, many of us, if we go to the store to buy, let's say, a piece of red meat, the more marbled it is, the better. That's fat streaking through the meat to keep it tenderized. That is not normal in things like liver and heart and kidneys. So by time the subcutaneous fat has arrived under our skin for the muffin top, we already know that there's angry fat. We call this visceral, meaning the organs, adipose tissue. So adipose being fat. So let's say that again, visceral adipose tissue, which is organ fat in the tissues. And we call that angry fat because that also increases inflammation, leading to things like high blood pressure, increased cholesterol, stress hormones that cause depression and anxiety, sleep disturbance, hormone cascades of missing periods or early menopause, abnormal bleeding, sexual dysfunction, desire, bone loss, and on as those processes that we talked about earlier.
Wow. Okay. So that's a significant effect from
Absolutely.
stress and a really important reason that we need to be very diligent about that right now. So here's another question then, based on what you just talked about. Is it possible, okay, so how to say that, this being politically correct, or just forget about the political correctness.
Okay.
In our society, yeah, that's probably a better way. In our society in North America, certainly not this way in the rest of the world, but in North America, we almost seem proud of our stress. We almost seem
Mm,
to, right? We judge each other a lot of the times by, well, I was at work 12 hours yesterday, or we're almost kind of proud of our stress, like it's
yes,
a marker of how hard we're working or how successful we are.
correct.
So this is a normal thing for us, I think, in North America. Is it possible? And so we said at the beginning, and I said at the beginning, this to me feels like it's not the normal type of stress that I suffer from,
Mhm.
the traveling and the work schedule and the constantly being in different time zones. This feels really different. Is it possible for people to be experiencing stress and not consciously recognize that they're stressed?
Absolutely. So stress changes form and function. So you're right. In North America, we are so um, martyred about our stress. Play dates for children 6, 8 weeks later, coffee dates or a dinner or a movie with friends months in advance because we're so busy. Busy has become the new badge of courage or success. And so when stress changes and we perceive different stress, it still is affecting the body the same. Remember, the body, the physiological response doesn't know the difference. I read an analogy a while ago that I think is apropos here, and it said, in the days when we used to be more agrarian, or before we had agriculture and we lived in the wild, your body doesn't know the difference if you're being chased by a tiger or if you're fighting with your boss in the office, or now over some form of media. It doesn't know the difference. It is going to react exactly the same. So stress can change. And even the idea of quietness right now could become a source of stress. I live near a major highway, and I've noticed how incredibly peaceful it is with the lack of constant traffic flow, even though it didn't seem to bother me before. I enjoy that. I enjoy the traffic noise and I enjoy the quiet. But for some people, being quiet is extremely uncomfortable. We don't, we
Yeah.
don't know ourselves. We don't like ourselves to a great extent, even though we can be very successful in business or in life. And we're not comfortable with ourselves. I always say the person to please is yourself, because you have to lie beside yourself at night in bed, and you have to get up and look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. And that's very foreign, especially in North America, where doing is more important than being.
Yeah, no, I agreed. And this is the reason that I'm asking, because I found myself, after this lockdown in the beginning, in the first couple of weeks, I was like, so this is weird. I should be panicking and I should be freaking out, right? Because of course, I'm an international speaker. So as you can imagine, everything has been postponed or moved to a later date. So
Sure.
there was no work. And I thought to myself one day, why aren't I panicking? Because my psychology, right? I come from a family, or I come from modeling, where if you don't have something to worry about, you find something.
Right.
So, and you know this. So I was, sitting there one day thinking, I'm actually okay. Why aren't I panicking? And then I was all proud of myself. And then one day I was watching the TV, I was watching the news at night, and I only watch it for about 10 minutes because, I am in real danger of my imagination taking over and going down that rabbit hole. And there was a headline on the news that said social distancing could last, what was it, 18 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at this headline, wasn't even really consciously aware of it. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, I was very aware that the black cloud was starting to come over,
Yes.
and I thought, oh, actually, I think I am dealing with stress. It's just not the normal kind of stress,
Right.
right? Um, so there's a significant then reason why we need to be very aware of this, particularly right now. Any suggestions on what do we do to battle this? So if our body doesn't know the difference, what do we do? Like, how can we become aware? What can we do to manage this? Because it sounds to me like the effects of this, and I've actually been worried about this all along. I don't know if you heard this on the news the other day, but in Toronto, there was a report that anti-anxiety medication is up by 34%.
I hadn't heard that, but I'm not surprised. Calls to suicide lines are just blasting off in numbers. People are ruminating, people are worried. And there is no way to know where and how this is going to end up. A lot of Canadians, particularly right now in the province of Ontario, are out of work. They're losing their jobs. It's a tough time. And worldwide, this is not just an isolated crisis like SARS was, where we had a great big cluster in Toronto, and then the rest of the country and the world was spared. This is ubiquitous throughout the world. So you asked about techniques. You know, I don't want to reiterate what people normally know, you know, in terms of go for a walk or get sleep. Those are very important. You know, I have been saying through this COVID thing, do what your mama taught you, the basics. Eat well, sleep well, get your greens in, don't eat a lot of sugar, watch your caffeine, watch your alcohol. Many people know those. So if it's okay, may I take a different bent on this?
Of course.
So a couple of things. We talked about the power of our thinking. And Bruce Lipton talks about this very well in The Biology of Belief, the book that really cracked the nut for his notoriety. We have choice. We have choice. First of all, raising our awareness to know what stress looks like for us and what it feels like. So physiologically, sort of just doing a sort of scan of our body and like, oh, how am I feeling? What's my heart rate doing? What's my breathing doing? Just feeling the muscle tension and understanding what it's doing in our body. And listening to ourselves. What are my thoughts? Are my thoughts above the line? So I always talk about the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. That sometimes is a choice. Yes, as we've been speaking, I've been drinking water, and it's not really fair because it is mostly full. But I get some negative people will look at that and say, but the glass isn't full.
I'm halfway.
There you go. Where optimistic people will say, oh, I've got plenty to go yet. So changing our words. Being in the moment, practicing mindfulness is really important, because really what you and I talked about a moment ago is gone, and my next thought that's coming hasn't been spoken yet. So really, truly, all we have is this moment, and staying mindful. Also, watching our vocabulary. So for example, I don't want to go broke is a whole different story that we tell ourselves than I will be financially solvent through this. Big difference in terminology. So when we find ourselves starting to focus on don'ts and shouldn'ts and won't and can'ts, that's a signal for us to stop and change our vocabulary.
Okay, I need to ask you this. And so I don't know if this is going to sound like an obvious thing, but I think it's maybe not so obvious to people watching this, or maybe it's not something they're aware of. Do our thoughts, and I'm right with you on that. You know that I absolutely am very aware of the power of self-talk.
Yes.
And I know where stress lives in my body, so I know where it lives. Is it true? Is it possible that all that negative self-talk about, you know, I'm going to be broke, or I'm going to lose my job, or my business is going to collapse, do words have the power to trigger the stress hormones?
Absolutely. Full stop.
Okay, so nothing else, just
full stop. Yes.
Okay.
Let me explain why. So a few years ago, I did a personal development course, and the personal development course said, we are not anything but our words. And so our words can manifest our reality. The old saying, what you focus on grows. So if we focus on demise, if we focus on despair, if we focus on lack, we will have lack, despair, and demise. If we focus on positivity, and I don't mean being Pollyanna-ish and saying, oh, I'm going to be a millionaire, even though I've never worked a day in my life, or maybe it would be, maybe you'll win the lottery, who knows? But manifesting is really important. And mindfulness, manifesting and mindfulness, those are really two ways of creating a new future, creating a new reality for ourselves. Instead of false evidence appearing real, why don't we just change it from fear to control? And that's what we can control, is our thoughts. So it gives us a whole different sense of self-efficacy. It gives us a whole new sense of what's called locus of control. So is the control from outside being imposed upon you and you're helpless and victimized and have no influence on it? Or is the locus of control from the inside where you can self-determine? And that's a whole more comfortable place for people to be, is an internal locus of control. It doesn't mean that we have some unrealistic Pollyanna-ish ideas, but to constantly manifest and to constantly be mindful. And one of the easiest ways to stay in mindfulness is gratitude.
Mm.
So again, even in your bottle of water, even though I've consumed some water in the glass, to be mindful that yes, and be grateful that there's still more to be had.
Oh yeah, I don't see this as half empty by any means. I see it as half full.
And
But
again, that's a perception. That's perhaps a trained response, or for some people, a natural response. But just to be conscious of the fact of how we perceive things can change our reality and can change our physiology in terms of where we end up from a negative stress perspective. In fact, our thoughts, our food, our environment, what we breathe, that's another technique that's easy, is just breathing 3 to 5 cleansing breaths can put us into parasympathetic drive, which is the opposite of the fight or flight. So when we do these techniques and we incorporate these into our life, we actually change the way our DNA is expressed. And Bruce Lipton, again, talks about this very profoundly in his book, Biology of Belief. So our DNA, the genetic material that codes for our well-being, whether it manifests disease or whether it manifests wellness, can be influenced by our thoughts, our beliefs, and our health practices.
So that's interesting. So a couple of things. So what we choose to consume, not just food-wise and beverage-wise, but what we choose to consume news-wise,
Correct.
has the potential.
Correct.
To create these stress hormones.
And consuming from our beliefs. What belief do you want to consume? What do you want to enter into your body? Og Mandino, again, another great author, writing The Greatest Salesman in the World, has a passage which I'm going to paraphrase. I don't know it exactly off the top of my head, but he says, when I love myself, which that self-compassion and self-love is another area of coping with stress, he says, I will zealously inspect all that enters my mind, my body, my thoughts, my soul. So consuming is not just about news or substances and stimulants like alcohol or tobacco or food or beverages. It's about consuming life. And how do you eat life? How do each of us go about digesting life a bite at a time? Really is a big difference.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And I'm thinking about myself now, because I've made a conscious choice to do this one day at a time. Because if I get too far ahead of myself, like I said, I've got a very vivid imagination and it can really go down a bad rabbit hole. So I've been consciously choosing to do this one day at a time. But you did mention something that I think may be causing a big issue. And that's, you talked about control and locus of control.
Yes.
And I think that's and maybe why a lot of people are, I know certainly for myself, why a lot of people are spiraling right now and needing those anti-anxiety meds and possibly, I don't know, antidepressants, or putting too much alcohol or food into their system, is I think that this is what this is creating is, I don't know about you, but I feel like I have absolutely no control in this. Like I can't even, it's like there's not even any facts in this, because so much of this is unknown. The disease, the virus is unknown. Not even physicians and the scientists. It's like it changes every single day. There was a very funny thing on Facebook the other day, and it was like 13 things about COVID-19. Don't need to wear a mask. It won't protect you, except, well, maybe it will, but it could protect other people. So kind of wear a mask, but it's really not. So it was just a funny thing that was highlighting, how things change. And so I think that makes us feel like we're out of control, because we don't even have a framework or facts, to work within, right? It's like this disease, you could end up on a ventilator or not. You could have it and not have any symptoms, or they might be really mild, but you could end up in. So I don't know. It's this thing about lack of control, I think, is stress inducing. Is that?
Absolutely. And so, this is sort of the craziness of the response. It's almost like we are in a maze, and you go down one road and you get into a roadblock. So you back off and you go down another road, and then there's a roadblock. So don't wear any masks. You'll be fine. Just social distance. No, wear mask. Oh, wait, no, maybe no. And so that's where the craziness comes in, and why people feel such lack of control, because the news is evolving. The information is evolving so quickly, and it is so contradictory at times. I have a colleague in Michigan. She's sort of right in the thick, very close to where the epicenter in Michigan is. And this woman is a brilliant, brilliant scientist. She's a pharmacist. And I texted her the other day and I said, I'm going to lose my hair for a couple of reasons through this COVID thing. Number one, because I'm washing it too often as I go in and out of hospital, for example. Number two, because of stress. And number three, because I'm going to pull it out because there's so much conflicting information.
Yeah.
And so, as you say, taking small bites and consuming small bites of information, but also not surrendering your own sense of innate intelligence and not surrendering to just somebody who says, do this, do that, it's this, it's that. Most people, even if they are not post-secondarily educated, have a way to sit down and weigh some evidence within our own capacity, within our own framework, and understand what's good for us and our families. And I think that's really important. And also, that self-compassion has to come with self-respect first, because just like in an airplane, they tell you put your mask on before somebody else's. If you want to really deal with stress well, I don't remember the woman who coined this phrase, you cannot serve from an empty vessel. You cannot serve from an empty vessel, whether it's your workplace online, whether it is your children and homeschooling, whether it's a spouse, whether it's reassuring an elderly parent who's physically distanced from you and you have this mechanistic way of getting to them, which is through video or the telephone. I think isolation kills, and keeping socially connected to the best of our ability is really important. I think for those who are really physical and tactile in terms of needing hugs, needing snuggles, holding hands, there is nothing wrong with grabbing your pillow at night and snuggling that, or a teddy bear. Those things helped us really a long time ago when we were children. And as adults, we feel a little self-conscious. But yes, that constantly changing mix master of a situation underscores some of the things. So when you want to go to somebody and get reassurance through a hug or a touch, a hand on the shoulder, that's not there right now. It adds another layer and dimension. So finding our needs, identifying our needs, and just getting them met wherever possible will also reorient the locus of control.
So that's really good advice. So thank you so much for all of this. Like I said, my suspicion is that people are feeling a different type of stress than they generally feel in their lives. Some might think they're all right, but I did for a while and then realized that actually I'm not. It's just not a kind of stress that I recognize.
Right.
And I think that it's really helpful for people to understand the damage this can do if we're not diligent about managing our own emotional health, because the damage that it can do physically, according to what you've said, is just devastating. And there's a chance that our hospitals could be full of other diseases, not COVID-19, if we don't do this right.
And so we didn't talk a lot about the psychosocial part of this either, in terms of depression, anxiety, PTSD. There is a lot on social media right now about PTSD, especially in frontline workers. And I am concerned about this, not only from a frontline worker point of view, but just the general public, elderly who have gone through previous traumas, military, etc. So this can have other ramifications. But again, having as much control as we can. And I don't say to become an ostrich and put your head in the sand about this, because we really do need to be informed going forward, not only from a health point of view, from a political point of view, an economic point of view, from just a global perspective, global consciousness, but also having ways to reassure ourselves. We didn't talk about faith-based practices. That's sort of a little bit taboo and not PC at this point in, in the 2020. But those types of practices, those down regulatory practices are really important. And if I can share one thing with our group, in my office window here, I don't know if you could see, I have a frame. And it's that 1980s prose. It's actually older than that, but it came out in the 1980s. That prose called Desiderata. And this keeps me grounded several times. And it says, and whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. And so when we get into these catastrophizing ideas like, oh, the world as we know it will never be the same, let's not look at it as the glass is half full. We may see an economic rebound, because I think most people are talking about economics, maybe human interaction in terms of, do we shake hands? Do we kiss on the cheek again? Maybe it's going to be an even better place. So I believe in human spirit. I believe in human ingenuity. Human behavior has gotten us out of crises before, Great Depressions, the Nazi regime, wars, economic downturns, former crises in terms of endemics. If we keep hoping and we keep our faith in humankind, I think that by itself will keep us propelling forward in ways that we may have never imagined before.
I agree. Thank you so much. I absolutely agree. I've been choosing to, my way of doing that when I do watch the news and I do hear those headlines, and they're always presented as fact. I
Yes.
remind myself that actually they're prophesizing. They're using models, that none of this is actual fact, but rather it's theory. It's something they think might happen. So I remind myself of that as a way to keep myself sane, that when they say 18 months to 2 years, they don't actually know that. It's a prediction and not a fact. And I hang on to that.
Correct.
I'm with you. I work with a lot of pharma and bio companies, and I
Yep.
trust my clients. I know they're working hard on finding ways to deal and cope with COVID-19, and I choose to trust them and human ingenuity that we will get through this sooner rather than later.
And
Yeah.
the global consciousness that's been raised can't
Oh,
help but to unite us as we go forward as well,
yeah.
in a very positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. They're saying we're all in this together, and if I allow my mind, it wants to argue and say, no, we're not. I'm, by myself here, and but it wants to argue. But in truth, we are in this all together. In that, everywhere around the world has facing cases of COVID-19, and most countries are in the same situation that we're in. We're all self-isolating. So in fact, we do have a common understanding around the world in this particular situation. So
And again, the perspective, we're all social isolating, but yet at the same point, we have so much more global consciousness awareness and unity around a single thing that is microscopic and can't be seen
yeah,
with the visible eye.
yeah, you're right. We're united around one common enemy, so to speak. Even though I like
Absolutely.
that word. Thank you so much
It's
for
been an honor.
agreeing to do this. And for the viewers, this is why I love Dr. Wiz, is that she can talk about medical science in a way that makes sense to us normal people through using
Thank you.
stories and analogies. So I really, truly appreciate that. And I know the viewers do as well. So if anybody wants more information, or because you are an expert on hormones, and cortisol is a hormone. So if anybody wants more information, or wants to follow you in your programs that you do, your Facebook page, yes, Dr. Wiz?
So my Facebook page is simply my name, Anna Marie Wysynski. You'll see a picture of me there with my stethoscope on. Or you could follow our clinic at Dr. Wysynski Bespoke Functional Medicine. So Dr. Wiz BFM on Facebook.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I will, of course, put your office phone number and the Facebook pages on so people can connect with you. Dr.
Thank you.
Wiz, if you're in the Toronto or Southern Ontario area, Dr. Wiz is still conducting appointments through virtual means or through telemedicine. So she's a fantastic doctor, and I know that you've been seeing your patients that way, either through Zoom or through telephone. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. And everyone, stay positive. Remember what Dr. Wiz says, all those things we know we should do, but watch your thoughts, because apparently the words that we put in our mind have the ability to trigger those stress hormones. So I'm going to be extra diligent about mine. So thank you.
My pleasure.